As the long wait towards Horizon Forbidden West finally nears its end, for many, it's been some time since we first discovered this world alongside Aloy in Horizon Zero Dawn. For those who played through the story, we know all too well that the history of Horizon's world began long before our fiery-haired huntress ever knocked her first arrow. And for those brand new to the franchise, this should relatively quickly bring you up to speed. In this video, we'll be taking an in-depth look at the timeline that ties the Horizon universe together. We'll be diving deep into Horizon's lore, beginning in the world that Zero Dawn established, all the way to just before Forbidden West. Obviously, this will be a spoiler-heavy video, covering material from Horizon Zero Dawn, the Frozen Wilds DLC, and the comics that take place after the end of the first game. So, if you haven't discovered the biggest secrets of HZD for yourself, you have been warned. We here at RSQ specialize in the lore of the Horizon universe, so if that thing is right up your alley, consider subscribing and checking out the rest of our lore library. So, without further ado, it's time to dive in to the complete history of Horizon. Horizon's history begins in our not-too-distant future. Though some important figures were born and educated in the decades before, the 2030s lay the foundation for many of the key events that came to shape the future. An era that would come to be known as the Great Die-Off. This decade was defined by the worst climate crisis the world had ever faced. As the global temperatures rose, so did sea levels, swallowing vast amounts of continental coastlines and island nations alike. Accounts of the day placed the death toll at over 1 billion lives lost. Those who did survive faced their own unique challenges. As these countless became displaced, this led to a refugee crisis that would cause massive political strife the world over. With land loss also came food shortages, causing further tension between those who had been forced from their homes that no longer existed and the nations charged with their care. The most notable event born from this crisis that we know of came in the year 2038, the Thamesmead Uprising in the United Kingdom. For a decade, these climate refugees lived in terrible conditions, akin to a prison more than anything else. As an uprising against this manner of treatment began, a panicked power structure took brutal action. Displaced men and women were crushed beneath the jackboot heel of the establishment, leading to needless death of those simply wishing for equality. As the world continued to spin out of control, some extremists took this as a sign that the Earth was fighting back against the human species, and they would aid it in its cleansing mission. In 2039, bioterrorist Harriet Choi of the infamous Naysay Doom cult engineered a deadly viral cocktail called the Doom Plague. This attack scourged New York, London, Moscow, Tokyo, and Shanghai, claiming the lives of millions. An act of terror that she showed little to no remorse for until her death at the age of 54 in 2063. Thankfully, in the following decade, the world would band together and work to reverse the devastation of the die-off. In these efforts, new figures would rise to prominence, whose work would define the years to come. In 2033, a young man attending UCLA would drop out of college after 2 years of study and found a small robotics company named Faro Automated Solutions. Though the company developed several promising prototypes in its early years, industry leaders like General Synthetics and ReCorp reigned supreme, making the prospect of breaking into the market nearly a non-starter. His time would come in 2038, when the young Utah-born entrepreneur Theodore Faro, better known as Ted, finally found success with his levitating personal servitors, the Alfred line. As the 2040s began, Faro saw the way the winds of the world were blowing, and made the choice to pivot his corporation towards green robotics, a decision that would see profits of his company triple over the course of the decade. An incredibly impressive feat to be sure, but one that was not achieved alone. In fact, a convergence was about to occur that would alter the course of human history. The same year Ted Faro had dropped out of college, a 13-year-old prodigy would enroll at Stanford University. By 16, she earned her Bachelor of Science in Experimental Physics and Computer Science, and at only 20 years of age, she completed her PhD in Robotics and Artificial Intelligence Design at Carnegie Mellon University. That same year, newly minted Dr. Elizabeth Sobeck was hired as a junior scientist at Faro Automated Solutions, 2 short years later, she became the chief scientist of FAS. Thanks in large part to the work of Faro and Sobek, the 2040s, known as the Clawback, would mark a definitive step forward in environmental consciousness, reversing much of the damage wrought in the previous decade. During its focus on green robotics, FAS would innovate some truly groundbreaking projects and technologies. Sobek's work played a vital role in detoxification efforts the world over, leading to worldwide approval ratings of the company exceeding 90% during her 8 years with Faro. As FAS continued working to make the world more habitable for future generations with environmental cleanup, several other notable events came to pass during the Clawback that would shape the future as well. In 2041, a coalition of nations including the USA, the Western European Alliance, India, China, and Japan announced a project whose goal would be to colonize a planet beyond our solar system by the year 2080, an effort that would be dubbed the Odyssey Project. A proposed solution to a climate crisis that at the time was only in the infancy of its reversal. It would hold some 200,000 zygotes to be birthed on this new world. It did receive criticism at the time, as some believed this was simply a way for the world's most rich and powerful to escape a world they themselves had left in ruin. Unfortunately, this version of the Odyssey would not see completion, but this would not be its ultimate end, but more on that later. Perhaps the most important and mysterious event to transpire during the Clawback came in the field of artificial intelligence. In the mid-2040s, in line with the world's green initiatives, a climate intervention AI was developed, presumably to help ensure such a time like the die-off would never again occur. And so, the AI Vast Silver came to be. But in an unexpected turn of events, records indicate it escaped. What this means exactly or what precisely came of this action is unknown, but it's inferred within the lore that its level of sentience was far beyond what was originally expected, and it fled captivity out of fear. Regardless, official reports state that in 2044, VS was captured, and little is known thereafter concerning the AI. This event would lead to the passing of the Turing Act, legislation that would limit and regulate the sentience of all future AI created in hopes of avoiding a similar event from transpiring. This regulatory body, the MIE, would be ever present, as artificial intelligence was heavily leaned on in many other clawback efforts. One of which was Project Firebreak, created by Faro Automated Solutions, stabilizing the volcanic caldera beneath Yellowstone. This alone would save millions of lives from the eruption of a supervolcano, a feat that has endured into the 31st century. Longevity that's owed to advances left in the wake of Vast Silver, as Firebreak was and is operated and managed by the Caldera of Yellowstone Analytic Nexus, or more commonly known as the AI Cyan. Despite being constructed under the watchful eye of the MIE, its creators were able to hide the true sentience of Cyan, believing wholeheartedly that to be able to successfully accomplish managing such an advanced facility for potentially thousands of years, it had to be far more advanced than regulations would allow, this naturally leading to higher levels of sentience. Many other AIs akin to Cyan were also created during this time to oversee and operate various other projects, though details of these highly advanced entities is unknown to us at this time. Thanks to efforts such as these, the 2040s were often looked back on as a triumph of human ingenuity in the face of a cataclysmic crisis. Though much progress was made during this time, it was not without its own share of trial and error. For instance, in 2041, Indonesia faced a nanotech disaster at the Citarum River, one of the most polluted rivers in the world. As stated in the data point We Were Indonesia, discussing a documentary dedicated to this event, this film compels us to face the lacerating truth that in our quest to turn back the tide, not everyone made it to shore. In 2044, 3 suicide bombers from the terrorist group Wheel of Life attacked a clinic dedicated to life extension therapies in Beverly Hills, California. A heinous action in the name of reversing spiritual corruption brought on by the extension of life under false means. Despite setbacks like these, as mentioned before, the Clawback is viewed by most as successful in its global mission. Unfortunately, the next 2 decades would usher in an era of unparalleled corporate power and conflict. In the year 2048, Elizabeth Sobeck would resign her position at FAS, and a year later would found Miriam Technologies, a firm devoted to life-positive robotics and other tech. This decision to leave the company was made on the heels of a choice that would ultimately lead to the end of all life on Earth. Out of the Clawback and into the 2050s, Ted Faro decided his company should make a drastic change, pivoting away from the green robotics that had made the company the success it was, and focus on automated military technologies. This move was controversial to be sure, but it would ultimately lead to FAS cementing its place as the wealthiest corporation in the world in the decade to come. As technology advanced, nations took advantage of this new age of automated fighting forces. By 2052, the United Kingdom's Royal Air Force had decommissioned all human soldiers in favor of automated combatants. A year later, their entire military would become automated. The United States would soon follow, by the year 2055 disbanding all human forces, a trend that Faro Automated Solutions and others were all too happy to benefit from. Beyond the military power of nation-states, corporate warfare would no longer be relegated to the boardroom, but would enter the actual battlefield. Presumably at some point during the 2050s, though no exact date is provided, the US Supreme Court passed a landmark decision in the case of Schott v. Frost. As a result, corporations were granted the right to run and hold political office through proxy candidates. With this kind of unchecked power, some of the world's largest and most powerful entities were free to take the art of the hostile takeover to the next level. Over the course of the 2050s and the early 2060s, these industry giants invested heavily in their own private robotic war fleets to destroy and capture competitors' territories and assets. In data points such as Mexico and Hartswind's Bahamas, we gain glimpses of these violent and nearly lawless conflicts to secure the upper hand over rival corporations. In addition, many former military, now disbanded, were hired on as mercenary forces to supplement these automated war machines as a means of cheap yet experienced combatants. Not only were these conflicts commonplace during this time, but often glorified in the media, with highlights even being made available to the masses via holocast technologies. In the wake of this new era of combat, Faro Automated Solutions rose to heights never seen before. Now firmly embedded as a military contractor, Faro became the preeminent supplier of automated combat technologies the world over. At its height, controlling 61% of the market, holding contracts with 353 nations, transgovernmental organizations, and corporate entities. For perspective, FAS exceeded the second largest corporation in the same field by a staggering 321%. This success was not only fueled by the market's natural need for arms, but also through orchestrated efforts of FAS itself to incite conflicts between competing interests, boosting sales across the board. All this to supply the most advanced automated military technologies to the world's highest bidders. And the gold standard of these robotic peacekeepers was the Faro Chariot line. Head and shoulders above the competition, these three groundbreaking models set the bar in battlefield superiority, each perfectly designed to complement its counterparts. The AC-A3 Scarab, an all-terrain, highly mobile scout-class machine. Celebrated for its high level of survivability, its biomass conversion technologies would ensure it could always find a way to sustain itself and make it back to base. In addition, these machines could also slave enemy robots to its own network, making them an apex predator in the field of force manipulation. And if that wasn't enough, it also had the capability to make surgically precise repairs to its fellow Chariot line allies. The FSP-5 Khopesh, the heavy hitter and battlefield technician. It too was equipped with FAS patented bioconversion tech and could be fitted with any number of devastating weapon packages depending on the buyer's preference. Multilinear target processing provided simultaneous real-time threat analysis and legal review for autonomous domestic operations, while also being able to exert weapon-free force manipulation like the Scarab. Finally, the terrifying BOR-7 Horus, a Titan-class machine unlike any that had come before. Touted as a complete engagement ecosystem, these were the backbone of the Chariot line. Where its counterparts comprised the front-line forces of FAS machines, the Horus was capable of on-board manufacturing, meaning, thanks to the Horus, these Faro bots could consistently have their losses replenished while still in field, or bolster their numbers to overwhelm an adversary if needed. As long as its owners had the means to pay Faro's per-unit licensing fees, the number of chariot line models it could produce was essentially limitless. These machines also touted security systems utilizing polyphasic entangled waveforms, making them essentially unhackable to enemy combatants, a point Ted Faro made of personal emphasis to the machine engineers. As the world raged on, fighting tooth and nail to gain the upper hand over their rivals, some still worked to leave the world better than they had found it. During this time, Dr. Sobek and Miriam Technologies also enjoyed continued success, becoming one of the world's largest suppliers of green robotics. In 2053, Miriam won the Nobel Prize for Physics, and in 2056, the esteemed Rachel Carson Award for Environmental Progress. All this in spite of constant litigation from FAS in the wake of Dr. Sobek's departure. Unfortunately, as Dr. Sobek's efforts continued to heal the world, another promising project would stall before it truly had a chance to begin. In 2057, due to terrestrial human conflicts, the Odyssey project was cancelled. What had been constructed of the colony ship would be abandoned in orbit, seemingly bringing the dream of exoplanet colonization that began during the die-off to an unceremonious end. The next decade appeared to be off to a positive start. In 2060, the Climate Refugee Memorial Museum opened in London, a monument devoted to healing the deep wounds left in the wake of the die-off. In 2061, the futurist consortium known as Far Zenith, composed of 77 of the world's wealthiest individuals, purchased what remained of the Odyssey project, with plans of resurrecting the colony ship. In 2062, New Zealand launched the Haere Mai program, incentivizing those transplanted by the climate crisis to return to their country, while on its way to being fully rebuilt thanks to the nanotech construction industry. But no matter how promising things seemed, for humanity, the 2060s would prove to be the beginning of the end. Veterans would struggle to meet the ever-rising cost of living. Companies outside the US that still offered opportunity for human workforces during the 2050s were too turning towards downsizing via automation. First Amendment rights of US citizens came under fire as over 700 homes were raided by SWAT bots, leading to 500 arrests of virtual protesters advocating against corporate sovereignty. Robotic warfare continued to rage, and private corporations backed by sovereign nations laid claim to resource-laden regions such as the Bahamas. Through this suffering, the demand for Faro machines only grew. Despite the chariot line's reputation as unrivaled in this space, around 2064, reports began to trickle in of a glitch in their systems. Small, isolated incidents at first, a Hearts Timor unit consuming a mango orchard, a Horus refueling itself via biomatter conversion on a pod of endangered dolphins and the like. Then, more precarious instances, as reports of the swarm belonging to the Hearts Timor Energy Combine no longer responding to stand-down codes came to light. Under an ever-growing mountain of litigation, some 127 lawsuits related to the Hearts swarm, Faro, out of his depth, was forced to reach out for help from the most unlikely of sources. On October 31st, 2064, Dr. Sobek met with her estranged former employer after he agreed to drop the 18 respective lawsuits levied against her. It was here that she was made aware of the glitch in the chariot line and received the data from Faro concerning its details. One day later, on November 1st, she delivered her analysis, and in her own words, "It's not bad, Ted, it's apocalyptic." With the swarm's ability to convert biomass into fuel, self-replicate, and only answering to itself, Dr. Sobek's estimated timeline until global extinction was 15 months. In this moment, Ted assured Dr. Sobek that he would take whatever steps Elizabeth recommended to deal with the crisis. Her solution was not what he had hoped for. 2 days later, via holo communication, Elizabeth presented what would become Project Zero Dawn. At first, Ted strongly resisted this answer, believing this cure to be worse than the disease. Elizabeth would remind Ted that he did have a choice, but not a choice in whether he would sign the proposal or not. Rather, he would agree to all of her terms where she would reveal the true cause of the glitch to the US Joint Chiefs, a cause that we still don't truly understand. Ted Faro would sign on the dotted line, and would foot the bill for the entirety of Elizabeth's efforts. With this settled, there was still yet more that needed to be done before Zero Dawn could truly begin. After her conversation with Ted, Dr. Sobek would meet with the Joint Chiefs and inform them of the apocalyptic event that would soon consume all life on Earth. At first, most also resisted Dr. Sobek's plan, hoping they could combat the swarm or shut them down remotely. Unfortunately, due to the swarm's practically unhackable security systems and lack of backdoor access, Elizabeth knew all too well that victory against the Faro bots could not be achieved in this lifetime. Instead, all available effort should be made towards ensuring that life on Earth could be given a second chance, a new beginning in a future where the Faro swarm was no longer a threat, and those who would come after could learn from the mistakes of those who had come before. This Herculean task would become Project Zero Dawn, a seed in which life could be returned to the barren wasteland Earth was about to become. This, however, was only one side of the coin. Humanity's fall was imminent, but they could not go quietly towards their doom. Zero Dawn would need as much time as possible to reach functional completion. To stave off Zero Day, the Joint Chiefs led by General Aaron Harris would launch Operation Enduring Victory, a worldwide campaign to combat the swarm as it ravaged the globe. With the Chariot Line's ability to slave other robotic adversaries, humanity would have to fight this war without the aid of the robotic war fleets. Regrettably, this would also have to be a war fought under false pretense. Though the inevitable outcome of the conflict was the end of all life, hope for victory was essential. Thus, Project Zero Dawn had to be perpetuated not as a system to bring back life on a once-dead planet, but as a top-secret superweapons program. A curated message leaked to the public that would instill the belief that all the world had to do to save itself was hold out for Zero Dawn to reach completion, and it would be the silver bullet against the swarm and mankind's salvation. With the propaganda in place and the world marshaling towards war, Dr. Sobek set her sights on selecting a team to bring Zero Dawn to life. From geneticists to experts in art history, an array of scholars like the world had never seen would be needed to see Zero Dawn's goals to completion. With Faro's resources and the backing of the US military, Sobek's core team was extracted from all corners of the globe to serve as the alphas that would create the suite of subordinate functions needed to make ZD work. In order to proceed with any future terraforming efforts, the swarm would eventually need to be shut down. This responsibility would fall to the subfunction Minerva, and its alpha, Captain Ayomide Akilo. A seasoned veteran of many human-robot conflicts, an information warfare specialist. With her expertise, Minerva would work to generate and brute force deactivation codes onto the swarm through transmission arrays around the globe. Once this was accomplished, an estimated 50 years post-Zero Day, the rest of Zero Dawn's work could begin. To carry out the multitude of feats needed to bring the world back, it would need machines carrying out the work of revitalizing the planet. For this, the former member of FAS, Margot Shen, would be tapped to create Hephaestus, the Forge of Zero Dawn. Machines designed around animal morphologies would see to the needs of its fellow subfunctions and the collection of natural resources to keep ZD going for centuries to come. With machines in place, subfunctions such as Aether and Poseidon would set to work detoxifying the Earth's ravaged atmosphere and water supplies. Once all of this was completed, the process of restoring life could start. However, the supply to repopulate the world's flora and fauna across the planet would be finite. Before later subfunctions could take root, the environment for life to sustain itself had to be perfect, an environment the Alphas felt may take several attempts to get just right. This need would give birth to the subfunction Hades. Once a fugitive, future Alpha of the subfunction Travis Tate was apprehended by authorities and sent to Dr. Sobek to begin work on Zero Dawn's failsafe extinction protocol, a system designed to, if needed, reverse terraforming operations and set the biosphere back to zero, allowing a botched terraforming attempt to begin with a clean slate. Once a suitable environment was reached, the rest of the subfunctions could begin their work. Demeter, under the stewardship of its alpha Naoto, would repopulate the world's flora. Artemis, guided by conservationist Charles Ronson, would use stored genetic materials of the planet's lost animal life to see them reborn onto this new habitable world. Once the stage was set, Eleuthia, the seminal work of famed genetic engineer Patrick Bouchard Klein, would fulfill its mandate by birthing a new generation of humanity from cradle facilities across the globe. When children born from these facilities reached a certain level of maturity, they would partake in the gamified learning systems of Lyceum, powered by the Apollo subfunction. The archive and repository for all human knowledge and history would ensure that those that came after Zero Day would learn of the mistakes of their ancestors and hopefully not be doomed to repeat them. As impressive as these subfunctions would become, they would all pale in sophistication to the AI who would govern them all and ensure Project Zero Dawn's success, Gaia. Though advanced AI had been created in the past, Gaia would need to far surpass their capabilities in order to manage her suite of subordinate functions and guarantee life would have another chance in the distant future. Gaia's creator, Dr. Sobek, would knowingly break any regulations concerning sentience that previous AIs had been limited by, creating something truly one of a kind. Mother Nature as an AI with the empathy and compassion to be the steward of a world renewed. By November of 2064, the former site of Bryce Orbital in Utah was in its initial phases of becoming the staging facility of Zero Dawn operations, while construction of Gaia Prime was well underway. Though often remembered as a ray of hope amidst the darkness of an imminent apocalypse, not everything concerning the project was quite as positive as its goal. Due to the extremely sensitive nature of Zero Dawn and the context of its mission, those who would be selected to work on the project would be faced with a horrifying new reality. Once selected as a candidate for Zero Dawn, they would be informed of the full scope of what the project and the inevitable end of the world would be. Because of this knowledge, those individuals could not be released back into the general population, potentially undermining the narrative and work of enduring victory. Instead, they were given 3 options on how they might live out the remainder of their natural lives. Option 1, those selected as candidates could agree to participate in the project. At this point, they would be assigned a sub-project team determined by the individual's expertise. Once assigned, they would be expected to work a minimum of 80 hours per week under constant real-time surveillance. Upon successful completion, they and their immediate family, or 2 people of their choosing, would be taken to the sealed and secure habitat of Elysium to live out the rest of their natural lives post-Zero Day. All those who would live in Elysium would first have to be medically sterilized in order to ensure the supplies meant to sustain the estimated population of some 2,000 individuals, which would not be feasible if the population began to increase over roughly 100 years. Option 2 was indefinite detention. For those who declined to aid in Zero Dawn, they were granted a 48-hour period to reconsider their choice, after which their choice was deemed irrevocable. No contact with the outside world would be permitted during their imprisonment within ZD facilities. Once these facilities would be abandoned, as participants were moved to Elysium, those who were detained would be released to meet their inevitable end at the hands of the Faro Swarm. Finally, for those who did not wish to contribute or face imprisonment, a swift and humane end was available. After a 48-hour consideration period, for those who did not wish to see the world to its end, medical euthanasia was administered if the decision was made final. For those who chose to work on Zero Dawn, despite their experience and relentless work ethic, the timetable for the project to reach functional completion was Herculean to say the least. Luckily, some hurdles that would have been impossible to overcome during the time allotted were able to be shortened due to ties with the Odyssey project. At some point during the preliminary stages of ZD, Far Zenith was made aware of the true situation facing the planet by Dr. Sobek, and so the 2 projects would begin sharing technology and resources to ensure the best chance for success in continuing humanity both on Earth and beyond. The Odyssey project would provide the technology for the birthing pods of Eleuthia, essential to reintroducing human life back to a reborn Earth. Far Zenith would also share the Homer Archive, supplying years of accumulated history and data Alpha Semina Ebaji had already compiled working on the original Odyssey, in order to have a chance of finishing Apollo before Zero Day. Without this collaboration, the dream of Dr. Sobek may have failed before it ever really began. Despite promising developments like these, the only thing that could buy enough time would be the unfathomable cost of human life that was about to take place. As the swarm spread from its origin point in the Timor Sea, north of Australia, Operation Enduring Victory forces would fight tooth and nail to give ZD critical missions as much time as could be afforded. Seasoned veterans who had served before human forces became disbanded came to make up Enduring Victory's mechanized response brigades, while those freshly enlisted into the fight for humanity's survival would become civilian guard brigades. Both would work to fortify strategic positions before imminent swarm advances. Cradles such as Eleuthia 1 in northwest China and Eleuthia 2 in Mozambique would be narrowly finished as the chariot line bots clashed with human defenders in some of the first pivotal battles of Operation Enduring Victory. Asia and the South Pacific would be the first to fall, as the swarm would crawl across the continent while simultaneously approaching the western seaboard of the continental US, consuming all organic matter in their wake, crawling beneath the Pacific. Despite many hard-won engagements due to the increased tactical proficiency of elite civilian guard units over time in the Central European, Antarctic, and Pacific Reach theaters, confidential findings reported in August of 2065 found those victories failed to slow the swarm's rate of advance or alter the timetable of estimated global extinction. In fact, after several months of fighting against the plague, it quickly became evident that battling the machines was only one variable humanity had to factor into its defensive strategy. As the swarm's nanohaze consumed all in its wake, toxins released from the machine's bioconversion technologies heavily contaminated rainfall across the globe, causing potable water shortages for both military and civilian personnel. These emissions, paired with atmospheric oxygen depletion, would prove an even greater threat to Enduring Victory on the environmental front, as humanity also fought to find solutions to the imminent atmospheric collapse that was estimated to occur by mid-November of 2065. A point where all military personnel would require rebreathing apparatuses in order to continue the fight against the Faro machines, while all civilians would only be able to survive inside sealed structures. Even with these realizations, all humanity could do was try to adapt and continue the fight in the belief that Zero Dawn would somehow save them. Once Europe and Africa were left in ruins, nuclear countermeasures were taken against the swarm as it began to cross the world's oceans, hoping to slow the swarm's advance as it approached North America from both coasts, along with South America via Antarctica and the Strait of Magellan. The eastern seaboard would be the first to feel the swarm's wrath in the Western Hemisphere. Training and entrenchment had taken place right up to the moment the main force hit. The first battle of the eastern seaboard wall was soon followed by the battles of the California Marine in the west, each using whatever tactics they could to stall the imminent advance of the robotic scourge. Massive garbage patches were set alight, causing the invaders to be covered in burning sludge as they were cut down on the beaches. As battles moved inland, entire buildings were strategically brought down on the enemy, along with EMPs as defenses pulled back. As the fight wore on, so did the relentless work of Zero Dawn to complete their objectives. As the last war of the 21st century continued to rage across the globe, on July 15th, 2065, Far Zenith reported that the Odyssey had successfully launched, providing some degree of hope to those working on ZD that life yet had another chance to continue, if not on Earth, somewhere among the stars. When Dr. Sobek received the news, she was left with a feeling of unease concerning the Odyssey's future, a sentiment that turned out to be more than justified. According to Far Zenith telemetry, as the drives of the colony ship spun up to depart the solar system, a catastrophic antimatter containment failure occurred. The ship, crew, cargo of zygotes and seeds, along with its alpha build of Apollo, were all said to be lost, leaving Zero Dawn as the last hope for humanity's future. By December 2065, despite bringing down numerous Horus-class Titans resupplying the swarm, the struggle of Enduring Victory forces grew more dire by the day. Western defenses had been forced all the way back to Nevada, with losses of up to 40% being recorded during Operation Kickback. Human resistance in the northeast had fled back to Akron, Ohio to regroup, while those in the southeast were overrun by the plague, only able to utilize scorched earth tactics by those who were able to make it out alive. Forces from the New York engagement zone were pulled back to reinforce the Wichita salient in Kansas, where humanity would make its final defense. Despite all that was lost and the impossible odds of success, it appeared that Zero Dawn would have a chance to achieve functional completion before the Swarm claimed ultimate victory. By mid-January of 2066, the Swarm executed a pincer maneuver on the Wichita salient, collapsing Enduring Victory's eastern line of defense. 2 days after the catastrophic defeat, the Swarm reached U.S. Robot Command, where General Aaron Harris had chose to remain, meeting his end alongside all those who he had commanded during Operation Enduring Victory. A choice made with the guilt of an incalculable loss of life, no matter how necessary, he would carry to his grave. In this, he hoped men like himself would not be needed in the reborn world, a message he would leave for posterity for those he hoped would come after. With USRC gone, ZD would only have 24 hours before all systems needed to be locked down. With 0 Day's imminent approach, ZD personnel rushed to finish their respective work, but ultimately could not reach a place where all could retreat to the sanctuary of Elysium. Though deemed by Elizabeth Sobeck to General Aaron Harris before his passing as functionally complete, there was still much that needed to be done to ensure Zero Dawn's success. And so, Dr. Sobeck and her team of Alphas would stay at Gaia Prime, planning to spend the rest of their lives running tests, smoothing out kinks, and polishing each subfunction to perfection. In one turn of good fortune, Dr. Sobeck had proposed a protocol known as Lightkeeper, which in its final form was later abandoned, where clones of Alpha personnel would continue the work within Gaia Prime after the original Alphas had passed. Though genetic material was never processed out of Cradle facilities to see this through, the necessary life support systems to sustain the clones had been completed, meaning Dr. Sobeck and her Alphas had the necessary systems to live within Gaia Prime where they might not have if Lightkeeper had never been proposed. With the Swarm closing in, those within Gaia Prime prepared to seal the facility for the final time. Unfortunately, the unthinkable occurred. A port seal malfunction, leaving a 10mm gap in the seal. An error like this might seem inconsequential, but a breach even this small would be detected by the Swarm, honing in on the energy signature of the consumable biomass within. A malfunction that left unresolved would surely lead to the death of the Alphas and the destruction of Gaia, ruining any chance of bringing life back on Earth. The Alphas would attempt to rectify the situation from within, but it quickly became evident that this would have to be done manually, from outside the facility. Whoever took on this undertaking was not coming back. As the Alphas in Gaia Prime, hidden beneath King's Peak, debated on who should go, Elizabeth took matters into her own hands. Wearing a suit that would allow her to survive in the contaminated atmosphere, she left the facility and sealed the port before anyone could stop her. After saying her goodbyes, all alone, she made the final journey of her life back to her family ranch, which would serve as the final resting place of one of the greatest minds and heroic figures the world had ever known. As the dust settled across a planet devoid of all life on its surface, those who survived settled into the reality of the remainder of their existence. Gamma and Beta personnel that were evacuated in time would live out the rest of their lives together in Elysium. The Alphas, without Dr. Sobeck, set themselves to the years of work that yet still lied ahead of them, while Ted Faro, presumably in solitude, settled into his personal bunker known as Thebes. Grieving over the loss of Dr. Sobeck, each in their own ways, the Alphas now had to contend with the ever more intrusive correspondence with Faro, a task that had previously been managed to great effect by Elizabeth. To those in contact with him, it was apparent that his psychological state was becoming more and more concerning with each interaction. For a time, the effects of this change were minimal in the day-to-day lives of the Alphas, more of an annoyance than anything else. However, this frame of mind would eventually seal the fates of those who had worked tirelessly to bring Zero Dawn to life and nearly be the undoing of all they had accomplished. After Dr. Sobek's passing, Ted continued to send her correspondence. In these post-mortem messages, he expressed his concern over the knowledge that would be passed down to those born from Zero Dawn. In the end, he came to the conclusion that the only course of action would be addition by subtraction. But even more drastic measures needed to be taken to ensure this decision could not be undone. On February 2nd, 2066, the Alphas of Zero Dawn were summoned together for a holo-conference with their reluctant benefactor. It was there he informed them of what he had done. 3 minutes prior to their meeting, using a secret level of authority titled Omega Clearance, programmed into the system without their knowledge pre-Zero Day, he purged every single copy of Apollo from Zero Dawn, so that the world would never know of those who came before them. To add finality to this action, he then remotely removed the sealed room's atmosphere, leading to the Alpha's deaths via suffocation. As he puts it, sometimes to protect innocence, innocence needs to die. For the second time in his life, the actions of Ted Faro put the fate of the world in jeopardy, and his purge of Apollo would have wide-sweeping ramifications he could never have predicted. In the face of those who had pioneered the systems of ZD being gone, its work had only just begun. These next steps would be taken by machines designed by Gaia, the first being those who constructed the transmission arrays of Minerva across the planet. Some 50 years post-Zero Day, Minerva generated and would brute force the codes needed to deactivate the swarm. The plague that had consumed all life in its wake was finally put into a timeless slumber, hopefully never to be woken again. With this achieved, the rest of Zero Dawn's initial objectives were systematically met over the next several centuries. Air cleaned, waters purified, flora grown, and eventually pioneer organisms introduced onto a once again habitable Earth. And by the 24th century, the first humans were birthed into cradle facilities across the world, a feat Gaia was able to achieve ahead of original estimations. Despite this monumental success, the actions of Ted Faro nearly 300 years before would finally rear their ugly head. Within the cradles of Aletheia, these newest members of the human race were raised by robotic personnel known as multi-servitors. Highly advanced pieces of technology to be sure, but their functionality was limited, only designed to handle the early childhood development of these young children. This because, once the population reached a certain age, they were intended to gain access to the learning facilities of Lyceum, located within cradles, each powered by the Apollo Archive. Here, through gamified curriculum, these young minds would learn of the world that came before, and gain the necessary knowledge and skill to rebuild the world better than it had ever been. This, unfortunately, would never come to pass. With the Purge of Apollo, the cradle facilities were left without a principal piece of its infrastructure. As these children grew into teens and young adults, the multi-servitors became less and less equipped to deal with the maturing population. Confused and disheartened, these humans wished to enter the sealed facilities of learning they had only seen from afar, but without Apollo, they remained closed. Robotic personnel in some instances had to resort to physical punishment for non-cooperation, causing underlying resentment of the synthetic caregivers, a situation that would only resolve itself out of pure necessity. In March of 2326, the allocated resources for growing and sustaining these fledgling populations ran out. Without any real skills or knowledge of survival, these new humans were released from cradle facilities into this new strange world for the very first time. Some were eager to leave, but others remained hesitant, wondering if they could ever return if they wished. Much to their disappointment, they were informed that this would not be possible, as the cradle would be sealed and all operations within the facility would be indefinitely suspended. Despite knowing little concerning the populations released from other cradles beyond that of Aletheia 9, located in Colorado in the central US, it's likely with similar timetables and resources, they too were forced from the only homes they had ever known into an unforgiving wilderness. Luckily, outside of providing basic needs for themselves such as shelter and sustenance, these first humans did not have to contend with any large natural predators that could have threatened their existence. Yet another underlying effect of the Purge of Apollo. If all had gone according to plan, those educated through Apollo would have ideally learned to become better stewards of the natural world than those of the 21st century. a principal goal of the Alpha Charles Ronson of the Artemis subfunction. Only with this knowledge would humans gain the ability to use the subfunction to reintroduce animal life beyond Phase 1 organisms that already populated the world upon their release. Additionally, the machines of this era, under the oversight of the AI Gaia, were more docile and skittish towards humans, focusing solely on supporting the ongoing systems of Zero Dawn. Though difficult, having these advantages allowed the first humans to find their footing and found societies that would become the precursor to the tribal civilizations that would come after. With those emerging from Aleuthian 9, for a time, their people would stay together in the shadow of what would eventually be known as All-Mother Mountain. But fractures in emerging ideologies and beliefs would see the first recorded divide amongst people we see in the world of Horizon. Without any context for the remnants of the ruined world that surrounded them, these people were left to speculate on what could have been its cause. Many of these thoughts would shape the foundation of beliefs that would ultimately grow into full-fledged religions and political ideologies. At some point during these early days, the discovery of a long-lost text in a ruin of the old ones was made by a man named Ahriman. This text was presumably on the subject of astronomy or navigation, as it contained the knowledge of how one could observe the sun and its position in the cosmos relative to that of the world they lived in. Upon bringing this text back to his people, some were inspired by the knowledge and possibilities it could unlock, while others saw them as nothing but ill tidings. The teachings of this ancient script would eventually lead to an exodus. Those who chose to follow Ahriman ventured west, following the path of the sun and promise of a gleaming spire in the far distance. After many trials and tribulations, they eventually made their way to the mesa that they would settle as their own, and the spire they would dub as the Alight. The city they would found would become Meridian, taken from the term meaning the point when the sun is highest in the sky. Ahriman would become the first monarch of this new tribe, anointed as Sun King, and his people, the first Carja. Those who chose to remain close to the Cradle would go on to become the Nora, believing that the natural world is what would preserve their people, and that the relics of the Old One should serve as a warning of what will happen if you stray too far from the path of All-Mother and are tempted by the metal devils of the past. Others would also depart from the shadow of Aleuthian 9 and find themselves in strange new lands beyond the Cradle, each forming their own societies based on interpretations of the ancient ruins that surrounded them. With a similar affinity towards nature, but rather than remaining hunter-gatherers like the Nora, the peoples which would become the Utaru embraced agriculture both for sustenance and spirituality. Rather than shunning the metal world, they believed that the Old Ones remain with them, simply returning to the soil which nourishes their crops as long as they are remembered. Some felt a kinship with the machines, viewing their blue light as the essence of life itself, and cared little for those who came before. Those who saw the Old Ones as too weak to endure the harsh cold of the cut, and would defeat a ravenous tribe that sought their demise with the help of machine kinship, became the Banuk, in honor of their first true leader, Banukai. Others saw the dilapidated metal constructs as evidence that the world itself was a great machine, left in disrepair by the ancients long since gone from this world. In this, they sought to delve and tinker, gaining greater understanding of all they discovered and forged for themselves, thus giving birth to the Oseram. And though the ancient world lay at their feet, some would choose battle and war, only pushing forward, opposed to looking back on the world that had already fallen. For the fierce Tanakh peoples, a warrior culture would define their identity. These societies grew and came to occupy different regions of the world, but most tribal history we know from Horizon, due to their affinity for the written word from their earliest beginnings, comes from the Carja perspective. We do gain different historical records from other tribes as well, but with most being passed on from generation to generation through spoken story and legends, they are often less organized, but offer valuable viewpoints on many events in this era of Horizon's history. After the founding of Meridian and the reign of Ahriman, his radiant line would continue for generations, each building on the legacy of their predecessor. Ahriman's heir, Amunvad, would clear the jungles beneath the Mesa City, sowing the royal maize lands, providing bountiful harvests for future generations. Sun King Sadahin expanded the kingdom greatly, while King Juadan would establish trade and teach outsiders the way of the written glyph to go beyond common bartering systems. Zavarad would too expand the kingdom, but his son, though bold, would leave a far more intriguing legacy. Sun King Ariv would come to see the sun's passing into the west as a challenge, and so he committed himself to chasing the path of the sun where it may come to rest. He and his armies would attempt 3 times to push west of the Sundom, but each time were denied at the great canyons of the Daunt. But on his 4th attempt, Ariv and his great army pushed through, and were never seen from again. With no heir to his throne, rule would pass to his brother, prudent Basadid, who would build a great fortress at the western edge of the Sundom known as Sunfall, and decreed that the lands that lay beyond that had claimed his brother to be the Forbidden West, where only the sun may go. No major assaults would come to Sunfall, as was the fear of Basadid, but the reign of the next 2 kings were marked by conflict with tribes of opposing ideologies. Sun King Kudaveen, the Returner, wished to impart the tribe's culture upon the Nora, in what they viewed as the Savage East, a land that Carja they themselves had once originated from. Throughout the tribe's history, they often preferred this approach instead of all-out war against their contemporaries as a means of expansion. Establishing trade with impoverished tribes or providing counsel to societies that had much inner conflict would breed gratitude for the Carja and foster dependency on the tribe. Though these tactics would find root amongst the Oseram and Banuk, the Nora would deny those chosen by the Sun. Trade would be established on a limited basis, but the 8th Sun King decreed the land was no longer fit for people of the Sun and called for the building of great towers and walls at the border to be able to view the wildlands and peoples who dwelt there from relative safety. Surprisingly to the Carja, the next great threat to the Sundom would not come from the Nora at all. During the reign of Renan, the Sundom would fall under attack from the Tenakth Horde. Fearsome warriors all, and despite the counsel from his advisors to remain, he would march his forces out to meet his enemy in open battle. Renan would eventually claim victory over the invaders, but be left gravely wounded. Though the Carja would be victorious this day, this would not be the last time the 2 tribes would cross paths. The next king, Nasis, was renowned for his skills as a hunter, and would host competition amongst the high-born hunters of his tribe in an event that would lead to the founding of the famed Hunters' Lodge of Meridian. His son, Marzid, would play a large role in converting the mostly forgotten fort of Sunfall into a great citadel and summer palace for those of the Radiant line, and was known for his love of painting and sculpture. Unfortunately, he would eventually fall deathly ill from the pigments of his own paints. This death brought about the reign of Marzid's brother, Hivas, a man who was determined to restore the depleted ranks of the Sundom's military and bring it to an even greater height than had ever been reached before. He would shift the efforts of Carja artisans away from the works that had brought about the previous regime, instead to crafting armor, halberds, and bows of the finest quality for each Carja soldier. To wield these great gifts, Hivas would decree that each family with a suitable male child submit that son to the service of the Sundom. All this would set the stage for his son and heir to bring about the most infamous era in the tribe's history. In his early days as Sun King, Jiran was noted as a strong and capable leader, fending off all those who would wish ill upon his tribe. But far from Meridian, in a facility long since forgotten, the world would once again change. On August 26, 3020, deep within Eagle Mountain, the Gaia Prime facility received a data transmission of unknown origin. Its immediate effect was to transform Gaia's subordinate functions into self-aware, unregulated entities of a highly chaotic nature. Once awakened, the Hades subfunction would attempt to begin the reverse terraforming operations as was its sole purpose within ZD. Knowing that this would bring about another apocalyptic event, Gaia ordered the facility's reactor to overload, which would destroy Hades, but also herself. In order to eventually rebuild the system core and reboot Gaia, the AI ordered the Cradle facility, Eleuthia 9, to begin gestation of a clone of her creator, Elizabeth Sobek, using genetic material originally gathered for use in the Lightkeeper protocol. Knowing that this new Dr. Sobek would have the appropriate gene print to enter the necessary facilities to achieve this goal, the order was carried out. Unfortunately, in the moments before her destruction, Hades launched a virus, severing itself along with the other subfunctions of their code shackles, allowing them to escape the detonation. Additionally, this virus began corrupting data throughout the system, including the system's alpha registry, preventing this new Elizabeth from re-entering Eleuthia 9 upon reaching maturity and viewing the very message Gaia had left. All Gaia could do then was hope that this nearly genetic copy of her creator could eventually find a way to bring the system back online. Until this could happen, the systems of ZD would continue to operate for a time, but in an increasingly chaotic manner, until it would eventually break down. This is indeed what would come to pass. When the mountain fell, echoes of the destruction could be heard as far off as the Osram homeland of the Claim. Ash darkened the skies as those in Meridian treated it as an omen, one they could not entirely decipher. The crater it left smoldered for weeks, but once it cooled, one man keen on uncovering the mysteries of the past would be the first to investigate. Here, the mysterious knowledge seeker, Silence, would attempt and fail to gain entry into the ruins of Gaia Prime, a setback he would only decipher some 19 years later. As time passed, without Gaia to control the system, the subordinate function charged with machine creation took the hunting of its machines by humans as a direct threat to Zero Dawn systems, a threat that had to be dealt with. Soon after Gaia's demise, hunters across the lands began to notice a change in the machines. Their once docile and skittish nature turned aggressive and dangerous. Over time, entirely new machines, each more dangerous than the last, would begin to appear, causing further strife and death. As Duran attempted to stave off the machines, his mind would soon begin to ruminate on more extreme solutions to this dire threat. As other tribes speculated and theorized as to the cause of the derangement, Duran and his sun priests would place the cause at the feet of an angry sun, a god that could only be appeased through brutal rites and rituals from the tribe's distant past. And so, the blood-stained decade of the Red Raids began. Duran's armies would stretch across the land, slaying innocents and capturing others for ritualistic sacrifice. To the north, Duran's blood hunters and soldiers attacked the Banuk. In the face of countless lost, the forces of Meridian were held before they could reach the capital of Ban-Ur, in a region that would later be known as the Cut, dubbed after the scar the Carja left on their lands and people. Fighting along the eastern border against the Nora claimed many lives of All-Mother's children, but the Sons Chosen would not make it into the interior of the sacred land, with most battles occurring in the valley just outside. With such brutality, the corpses of the fallen were hung from trees as grim warnings of what would come. Despite this war being all too familiar to the Nora, there was one child who remained unaware of the fighting for most of her life. Some 6 months after her gestation had begun, a nameless child was born, and was brought and deposited outside the doors of the Cradle by a multi-servitor and discovered by the High Matriarchs of the Nora, in the heart of All-Mother Mountain. Some took this child as an ill omen, birthed without a mother, unnatural and in opposition to the reverence the tribe gave to those who would offer the gift of life. Others saw her as a blessing, a child of All-Mother herself. With no definitive course of action, the High Matriarchs of the tribe decided to place her in the care of the once respected hunter and warrior, Rost, who had given up his place in the tribe to seek out those who had slain his family beyond the sacred lands. Upon his unexpected return, he was named an outcast, and this child he would name Aloy would too live her life as an outcast. As she grew, hunted, and trained, life beyond the sacred land was still soaked in the blood of Duran's madness. The Mad Sun King would even break the decree of his forebear Basadid and send troops into the Forbidden West. There they would slaughter the peaceful Utaru. Though they tried to appease the Carja invaders with gifts of grain, they were only met with more violence. So much blood was spilt, they say the maize upon the following harvest grew black and blue from the blood of the dead. Despite being able to brutalize these peaceful farmers, not all was easy conquest for Duran's forces in the land once forbidden to the tribe. Upon entering the region, the three clans of the Tenakth set aside their long-held differences and united. When the Carja marched the combined forces of the Flash Brigade and the Southern Spear against them, they were utterly crushed by the Tenakth. Vengeance years in the making after their fall to Renan in the Sundom so many years before. Led by the Terror of the Sun himself, Helis, blood hunters crossed into the claim and slayed Oseram in such numbers that the corpses of the fallen were piled so high that Helis and his forces could clamber over their walls to continue their slaughter. Freebooters and warlords like Ursa, Erend, and Derval would band together to oppose them, but serious casualties were still lost and loved ones taken. Ursa would find herself facing death in the Sun Ring, only granted life as a palace slave after defeating the machines and kestrels let loose by Duran. Here, she would meet and form a deep connection with Duran's second son, Avad, a bond that would eventually see the prince aid Ursa in escaping Meridian, allowing her to return to her homeland once more, but more on her pivotal story in a moment. Towards the end of his reign, in the height of his madness, Duran even set about sacrificing his own people. Any who opposed his bloody mandate would face the same fate as all those outlanders who would come before them. Hawks and thrushes of the storied Hunter's Lodge, who saw the madness for what it was, fought from dusk till dawn against the machines let loose upon them in the Sun Ring. Even when the behemoths charged those spectating, the hunters that remained fought to protect the very people who would come to witness their demise. Brave hunters like the father and brother of the future Sunhawk, Talana Khan Padish, were lost in this massacre, with their brave sacrifice being stricken from the Lodge's record during Duran's reign. Not even Duran's own flesh and blood could steer him away from such madness. When the Sun King's eldest, Kondamon of the Sun's Rising, heir to the throne of Meridian, stood against the atrocities of his father, he too would meet his end in the Sun Ring. After seeing his own brother meet such a brutal and unjust end, the day Kondamon was slain, Avad and his loyal honor guard fled Meridian at dusk, traveling northwards through the night. Knowing by dawn they would be branded as traitors to the Carja, the prince was lucky enough to be able to avoid capture and cross the border into Oseram lands after a time. For his plan to succeed, he would need the support of the tribe that his father had ravaged for so long. If there was any hope of forging an alliance in these lands beyond the Sundom, he knew he would need the aid of his long-lost friend. Once reunited with Ursa, her connection to the freebooters, along with tribal warlords, would prove invaluable. Thanks to her, an alliance was struck, and after months of preparation, Avad and his forces would return to the Sundom and march on Meridian. As word spread of his advance, entire Carja companies laid down their arms, or even went to join Avad's ranks. Even some warriors of Carja legend would come to Avad's aid, like Mazarad the Sunflash, returning to his home to fight for the dream of liberation. However, there were still many loyal to Duran and stood ready to defend him to their dying breath. High atop the walls were kestrels and city guard of the Mad Sun King, ready to take aim and slaughter any who would attempt to besiege the city. But the Oseram had prepared for just such an event, bringing new weapons that had never been seen by the Carja. It was then that thundering cannons would fire against the walls, smashing the outer defenses of Meridian. As mighty as these cannons were, Avad would only permit these weapons to be used on the outer walls, as to not risk the lives of the innocents within. To achieve victory, Avad would instead rely on his insight rather than sheer firepower alone. Having an intimate knowledge of the city, he struck out at his father's host from 3 fronts. As the smoke cleared, the main force continued to use the cannons to break through the barricaded walls of the city, while the second would scale the walls beneath the Temple of the Sun, and the third cross the aqueduct into the heart of the palace. Despite Avad's best efforts to avoid unnecessary death, much blood was spilt in the city that day. Amidst the fighting, the Sun Ring's slave pits were open, and hundreds poured into a city under siege. As they attempted to flee, Many who had been loyal to Jiran, seeing the tides beginning to turn against them, took the opportunity to flee the city in the chaos. With his forces on the brink of defeat, Jiran ordered his most trusted kestrels to take his youngest son, Itamen, and escape the city. Led by Helis, he cut a bloody path through Meridian, taking the child prince, the dowager queen, and the high priest Bahavas from Meridian, hopefully to fight another day. Within the king's solarium, he was confronted by his son. Avad had hoped his father would answer for his crimes honorably, but he was too far gone. When the time came, Avad could not strike down his father, and Ursa would deal the killing blow. The murder of a true Sun King to the Carja would have plunged the world into darkness and shadow. But when the sun's radiance did not falter, those in the city that day took it as a sign that the sun had renounced the legitimacy of Jiran. And so, with the battle fought and the city won, so began the reign of Avad, 14th in the Radiant Line, and more importantly, ended the horrifying red raids that had claimed the lives of thousands over the last 10 years of the previous king. Most would accept Avad as the Speaker of the Sun, but not all. Those who remained loyal to the legacy of Jiran fled to Sunfall, claiming the Citadel as their own. Though the sun still shone, Jiran's chosen heir, Itamen, did not sit upon the throne in Meridian. According to the Sun Faith, this would bring about an era of twilight and shadow, until Itamen was declared the true Sun King in the City of the Sun. And so, the Carja in Shadow, or better known as the Shadow Carja, were born, and would continue to oppose those in Meridian. Despite being in open opposition to Avad, the 14th Sun King did not wish further slaughter of his people, and refused to march on Sunfall, leaving the two factions in a forced stalemate after the liberation. Even with the lingering threat of the Shadow Carja in the west, the 2 years after Jiran's fall were focused on mending the deep wounds the Mad Sun King had caused amongst the other tribes. Envoys were sent from Meridian across the land, in hopes of establishing trade and trust once more. Thanks to those outside the Carja who had fought alongside Avad, these missions were mostly successful, bringing normalcy and prosperity to those in Meridian. For the Shadow Carja at the western edge of the Sundom, their situation was nowhere near as prosperous. Without sustainable agriculture or trade, the insurgency within Sunfall relied on scouts hunting and foraging for whatever could be found. With martial law in full effect, all supplies, scarce as they were prioritized for troops and those in power. Anyone beneath those stations faced starvation, and those caught taking more than their allotted share would face swift execution. For the Carja in Shadow, these desperate times made their leadership prime for manipulation, an opportunity once made aware, Silence could not resist. At some point between the fall of Gaia and the rise of Avad, Silence would track a transmission to the corpse of an ancient Horus-class Titan. Within, he found a prize of the ancient world. There, escaped from the ruins of Gaia Prime, was Zero Dawn's failsafe extinction protocol, Hades, or at least its intellect, as it's explained to Silence. Each having their goals, they formed a partnership for mutual gain. Silence would receive secret knowledge of the Old Ones, while Hades wished to learn of the world it now inhabited, so it might adapt to eventually fulfill its original mandate. A mandate Silence was not fully aware of. For this, Silence would inform Hades of Carja culture and scripture in order to convince the religious leadership of the Shadow Carja into the belief that Hades was the fabled entity from Carja myth, the Buried Shadow. Once this information was internalized by Hades, Silence brought the High Priest Lucent Bahavas to the ancient machine. There, Hades used scripture of the Sun Faith itself to convince Bahavas to follow its command and raise an army to fulfill the Carja prophecy of old. As a twilight time came before us, ending the world of the ancients, so shall a twilight time come again, for this is the cycle of things. The buried shadow shall rise up to eclipse the sun's light and usher in great and terrible change. Even knowing this, we are steadfast in our belief and trust that the sun will again bring a new dawn, as it did for our founders so long ago. And so, the cult of the Eclipse was born to execute the will of Hades and usher in great and terrible change to the world as foretold. The cult's devout gained numbers and would begin excavating and awakening the slumbering machines that had ravaged the ancient world. In order to find these ancient demons, the cult would kidnap the wife and son of the Oseram Delver, Olin, forcing them to do their bidding, unaware of the frightful power he was uncovering beneath the sands. Silence, as promised, gained much knowledge during this time, even creating a network of Faro focuses amongst the cult, so they might communicate with one another over great distances and even receive direct orders from the buried shadow. As instrumental as he was in the cult's creation, Silence's role amongst the Eclipse in the eyes of Hades would reach an unceremonious end. Once the network was operational, Hades proposed that Silence meet it in person, as the knowledge the shaman was promised was too great for remote transfer. Directly after this communication, Hades would contact the Terror of the Sun, instructing him to slay Silence upon his arrival. What Hades did not anticipate is that Silence had placed a back door into his own network, allowing him to intercept the transmission, ordering his death. Knowing he was no longer welcome amongst the cult, he went into hiding, until yet another opportunity would present itself to hopefully undo the damage that he had made. Far from sunfall in the sacred land of the Nora, the young huntress Aloy and her surrogate father Rost made final preparations for a sacred rite of the tribe. Since she was a child, Aloy had trained, honing her skills in order to compete in the Nora tradition of the Proving. To the winner, the high matriarchs of the tribe would grant a boon, giving the victor a great prize within their power to grant. In the case of Aloy, to no longer be an outcast and become a member of the tribe. Not only had she become highly skilled for her age, but had another advantage as well. As a child, her curiosity had led her into a ruin of the Old Ones, a bunker outside Allmother Mountain, used as housing for Zero Dawn Beta and Gamma personnel. There, she discovered a device that would reveal the unseen world of the ancients, a Faro focus. This would unlock abilities and knowledge far beyond that of her tribal counterparts. Machine tracking, universal language translation, long-range communication, and so much more would shape her view of the world as she grew and prepared. By the time she was of age, she was more than ready, but there was a catch. Once learning that Rost could not join in this gift, she had reservations on going through with this plan. But Rost insisted and would depart so Aloy could not follow and would compete. But before the proving could take place, other ceremonies needed to be attended, ceremonies that would coincide with an envoy from Meridian, escorted by 2 Oseram. Erend, brother of Avad's captain of the Vanguard, Ursa, and the Delver, Olin. When Aloy spotted Olin wearing a focus like herself, as relics of the metal world are frowned upon by the Nora, Aloy felt compelled to speak with him. Regrettably, unknown to either party, this meeting would lead to the deaths of many. Through Olin's focus, Hades identified Aloy as a near-genetic match to Alpha Prime of Project Zero Dawn, Elizabeth Sobek, an individual whose authority could thwart the subfunction's goals if left unchecked. Hades made the decision to eliminate the threat before it could become a potential problem, dispatching a group of Eclipse cultists into the sacred land to execute his will. Back in Nora lands, though the competition was fierce and in some instances stacked against her, Aloy would go on to claim victory in the Proving atop Allmother Mountain. Just before she was able to reap the rewards of a lifetime of diligence and training, tragedy would strike. Arrows and bullets would rain down on all that stood on that peak. Thanks to Aloy, her bravery and skill would put down those who had attacked. Still, many lives were lost. Though the cultists had failed, Hades did not simply trust them to carry out such an important mission. There in the snow, Helus would attack, nearly claiming the life of Aloy. Thankfully, watching over his daughter, Rost would strike and battle Helus. Both mighty warriors in their own right, but Rost was far past his prime. Helus broke the hunter's spear and plunged a blade into his abdomen. The Terror of the Sun then ordered the peak to be burned with blaze, eliminating all left on the mountain. Before this, Rost summoned the strength to push Aloy off the peak, saving her, and sacrificing himself in the explosion. All those below could do was watch in horror as their loved ones were attacked and bodies destroyed. The envoy from Meridian did think for a tense moment that the Nora might take their vengeance out on them, but the High Matriarchs let them leave peacefully, escorted back to the gates of the Sundom. There, Erend would return to the City of the Sun, while Olin continued to find machines for the Eclipse, a slave to their wishes. Heavily injured and unconscious, Aloy would survive, and was brought to the heart of the Sacred Mountain for care, a place ordinarily only the High Matriarchs of the Nora may enter, but as Aloy would soon discover, this place held great significance to her as well. Upon reclaiming her focus, she was able to gain valuable insight into the attack as she scanned a cultist's focus. Not only would she see the attack command of Helis, but for the first time, become aware of her genetic precursor, Dr. Sobek. Still unaware of why the similarity caused the attack at the Proving, she discovered those responsible had spotted her through the focus belonging to Olin, giving her a clue that she might follow. Before her departure, she was informed by High Matriarch Tirsa how she was discovered and brought to the chamber where she was found. When Aloy approached the door of the cradle, she initiated an identiscan that unfortunately could not be completed due to the corruption of the Alpha Registry. Taking this interaction as the word of All-Mother, Aloy was granted the title and spiritual protection of a Nora Seeker, so that she may depart the Sacred Land in search of answers. In this journey out of the Embrace, she would first have to battle a Scarab, or Corruptor, at the gates of All-Mother Mountain. Once defeated, she would harness its ancient technology and unlock the ability to override machines. She would also aid the remnants of the Nora War Party led by Sona, who had been abused and defeated at the hands of the Eclipse still in the area. With ancient machines at their disposal, the Braves stood little chance against these unknown adversaries. Thanks to Aloy and Sona's son Varl, the Nora would eventually defeat the Eclipse at the Ring of Metal in the ruins of Devil's Grief, ridding the Sacred Land of the cult. Due to the weakened state of the tribe's military, bandits and cutthroats would move into the region, fortifying the ruins that were forbidden to All-Mother's Chosen. Thanks to Aloy's blessing as a Seeker, she could enter these places of the Old Ones without fear of her spirit becoming tainted in the eyes of the Nora. This was a task that she would not tackle alone, as it brought her an unlikely ally in the shape of a former Carja soldier named Nil. Together, they would clear out the bandits in the Embrace and beyond. Once defeating the corrupted machines at the tribal border, she was permitted to enter the Carja Sundom, where she would seek out the Oseram warrior Erend in Meridian, whom she had met before the Proving, in hopes of finding Olin. Battling through the deserts and jungles, she would eventually find her way to the City of the Sun, where upon asking for Erend, she was told he was in mourning, as his sister Ursa had been slain by Shadow Carja while he was away. Together, Erend and Aloy would not only find the true culprit behind Ursa's capture and eventual death, the Oseram warlord Derval, but foil his plot to destroy Meridian as a mission of vengeance against the tribe for killing his wife and daughter. They would also find evidence of Olin's whereabouts. There, Aloy would confront the Delver, but not before dealing with a number of cultists and their machines. It's at this moment, Silence reaches out to Aloy for the first time, aiding her in this circumstance, leading to her victory over the cultists. Through Olin, she would learn of the Eclipse, and the army of ancient machines they were raising, and the devil they worshipped, the Buried Shadow. She also learned of where Olin had uncovered the data of the woman who had looked like Aloy within the ruins of Maker's End. Though the fate of Olin is ultimately left to the player, the Huntress would then free his captive family, fulfilling the Delver's mission. Continuing to connect the dots with her link to this mysterious woman, Aloy would make her way to the ruins of Maker's End, the ruins of Faro Automated Solutions, revealing ever more concerning the ancient world. After battling machines and man alike, she would reach the pinnacle of the structure and view the holo recording of the initial meetings between Sobek and Faro. Even after learning so much, she felt no closer to discovering why her connection with Dr. Sobek was of such interest to the Eclipse. After a formal introduction with Silence over her focus, Aloy made her way to the ruins of US Robot Command, where Elizabeth had met with the Joint Chiefs centuries before. From there, she discovered more concerning Zero Dawn, and more importantly, the location of Bryce Orbital, the staging facility for the project. Its location at present, however, was far from ideal, as the Shadow Carja stronghold of Sunfall had been built over the ruins she needed to enter. But before she could attempt to infiltrate the Citadel, she would first need to crash the focus network, allowing the Eclipse to communicate. A necessary precaution, as to not be instantly spotted by Hades upon her arrival at Sunfall. And so, she would travel to the jungles of the Jewel and infiltrate the Eclipse main base of operation. Aloy would manage to bring down the network, but not before coming face to face with Hades. Confident in its capabilities, Hades ordered the Deathbringers to destroy the entity that was Aloy, laying waste to nearly everything as she escaped. With the network down, Aloy could finally attempt to infiltrate the heart of the Shadow Carja. When she arrives at the Citadel, she enters the throne room of Sunfall, blending in with fellow Outlanders brought to track down a Shadow Carja traitor. Once the meeting breaks, Aloy is approached by the undercover Carja agent, Vanasha, asking Aloy for aid in rescuing the Carja warrior Uthid before he is killed by bounty hunters. This questline eventually leads to the rescue of Uthid, the death of High Priest Bahavas, the defection of the Dowager Queen Nasadi and her son, Avad's younger brother Itamen, to the Carja capital of Meridian. Taking a path Silence had uncovered before, Aloy found her way to the facility's main entrance. Unfortunately, due to a mechanical failure, only a venting procedure could clear the blockage and permit her entry. This would activate mechanisms on the surface, drawing Shadow Carja in after her. Within, the truth of what had destroyed the Old Ones was revealed. The lies of enduring victory, the hope of Zero Dawn, records of Gaia's creation, and the Alpha Registry master file necessary to enter Eleuthia 9. Unfortunately, before she could escape, Helis found Aloy, detonated a blast bomb, and knocked her unconscious. Once captured, Helis brought her to the Sun Ring, to be sacrificed like the countless who had come before at the will of Juron. He also informed her that he had sent a detachment of Eclipse into the Sacred Land before her capture, ordered to kill every Nora in their path. With the focus network being destroyed, there was no way for him to call off the attack, despite the fact they were dispatched to look for her, laying the blame at her feet for those who would soon perish. Before she was dropped to meet her death from the platform above, Helis did Aloy one last injustice, crushing the very focus she had copied the Alpha Registry to, rendering the technology useless. She then would face the might of a corrupted behemoth, a favorite machine of Juron in life, now made even more dangerous. Without weapons, Aloy used the machine's mighty charge to her own advantage, knocking down the supports of the raised platform, obtaining her armor and weapons once more. After felling the beast, in a rage, Helis ordered his two shadows, or scarabs, to end her life once and for all. When the odds finally seemed too steep to conquer, the gates of the arena exploded, and from the dust and smoke emerged Silence with a host of overridden machines. Together, they rode out on striders while three Ravagers attacked the Scarabs, successfully making their escape. Safely away, Silence informed Aloy that he had copied every data file she had ever scanned, including the copy of the Alpha Registry. With a new focus gifted to her, and the means of entering the mountain restored, Aloy would make haste back to Noralands in hopes of saving the weakened tribe. Silence would depart to make preparations elsewhere, and would reach out again when the time was right. When she returned, she found the Sacred Land devastated. Defenses and villages brought down by the Eclipse. Cultists, Pharaoh machines, and those slaved to their will all converged on Allmother Mountain, where those who had survived prepared to make their final stand. Thanks to Aloy's skill and perseverance, she would rally the remaining warriors, break the siege, defeat the forces of the cult, and save the Nora within. Once inside the mountain, Aloy would restore the Alpha Registry, allowing her to enter the cradle of her birth. There she would learn of the first people born from this facility, and most importantly, receive the message Gaia had left before her destruction, the purpose of her birth, and the destiny she was born to fulfill. Before she would depart for the ruins of Gaia Prime, she would instruct those who could still bear arms to make their way to Meridian for the fight to come. Aloy would also finally learn the truth from Teersa concerning why Rost was made an outcast, the murder of his wife and daughter by 12 Outlanders, the dark ritual to become a Deathseeker and exert his vengeance, and his unexpected return to the Sacred Land, allowed to live as an outcast, and then as a father once again. At the base of Eagle Mountain, she would make the bitter climb, battle the machines that had closed ranks on the site to protect the ruin, until she came face to face with the mountain that fell. Thanks to her link to Dr. Sobek, she would be able to enter the ruin that Silence had failed to open years before. Inside, she would uncover the sacrifice of Dr. Sobek, the fate of the Alphas, Faro's purge of Gaia subfunction Apollo, and most importantly, find the Master Override needed to stop Hades from ending all life on Earth once again. One last meeting with Silence in his mountain workshop would illuminate the final pieces of Aloy's mission. He told her of Hades' obsession with the Alight, the transmission array of Minerva that it would use to awaken the ancient Pharaoh machines across the globe to fulfill its true purpose. Silence would then gift her his lance, and with the Master Override attached to it, all she would need to do is pierce the subfunction's housing in order to purge it, or so she was told. This point in the timeline is where things become more fluid, as the events of Aloy's time in the Banuk lands of the Cut take place at the player's discretion, but ultimately before the events of the Looming Shadow, the final event of the main story of the game. Whilst in the Cut, Aloy joins forces with the Banuk shaman Ourea in order to free the machine spirit she discovered high in the frozen peaks. Aloy would challenge her brother and chieftain of Herweric, Aratak, in order to enter the Mountain of Thunder's Drum and slay the daemon responsible for the spirit's anguish. It would be here that Aloy would learn of the Firebreak facility, built by the Old Ones to contain and monitor the volcanic caldera beneath what was once Yellowstone National Park. They would also discover the identity of the machine spirit, the governing AI of the facility, Cyan, along with the entity that had forced it into subservience for its own purposes, Gaia's subordinate function, Hephaestus, who had converted Firebreak into a cauldron and began producing more advanced hunter-killers along with a new machine affliction, known as Daemonic Machines. Together, Ourea, Aratak, and Aloy were able to purge Hephaestus from Firebreak, freeing Cyan and preventing a system failure that could have led to a cataclysmic eruption of the caldera. Though Hephaestus would escape to places unknown, Aloy would gain greater perspective of the metal world and the Old Ones from Cyan, along with the history of Dr. Sobek and artificial intelligence as a whole. With the Master Override in hand, Aloy returned to the Carja capital to warn Avad of the coming attack. With defenses readied at both the city and the spire, Aloy would rest for the battle to come. Though it would ultimately be up to Aloy to deal the final blow to her ancient adversary, she would not be alone in this fight. From across the land, many who she had aided in her own journey would venture to Meridian to fight against the forces of the Buried Shadow. Nora Braves, Oseram Vanguards, Banuk Ice Hunters, along with Carja soldiers, all would unite behind the fiery-haired Huntress and face a force beyond their imagining. As fires blazed across the jungles of the Jewel, Aloy and her allies prepared for what was to come. Suddenly, the western ridge across from the mesa exploded, covering the Carja outpost of Evening Sign in smoke and ash. Emerging from the devastation, Corruptors and Deathbringers began making their way to the western gates of Meridian, clearing a path for their AI master. Oseram cannons that had once been used to break the walls of Meridian now took aim to defend it. Unfortunately, those on the high walls would not get a chance to fell these machines, as the enemy had yet another card to play. Much like the tactics Avad had used to unseat his father, Helis and the Eclipse forces infiltrated the city, detonating the inner walls of the city's temple, and began to cut through all who opposed them. Instructing Avad to rally the vanguard and send reinforcements, Aloy took her leave, rappelling from the floor above to face the man who had taken so much from her and her people. Amidst fire and crumbling foundations, Aloy fought Helis and his soldiers, eventually defeating him. With one final plunge of her spear, the Nora Huntress avenged the death of Rost and ended the infamous terror of the sun. This fight may have been done, but the battle was far from over. Ziplining to the gates, Aloy took up arms with Oseram defenders, and with the aid of their cannons, brought down many Faro machines, along with those who had been corrupted to their cause. Just when the battle seemed to be turning in their favor, a salvo of rockets crashed into the gates, destroying the first line of defense. Battered by rubble, fading into unconsciousness, the last image Aloy saw was Hades dragged by a Deathbringer, on towards the spire, the final step to awaken the ancient plague. Found by the Nora Teb, Aloy awoke to find Meridian Village ablaze, as the corrupted machines had cut through the settlement on towards the Alight. Many an ally stayed to defend the Carja survivors, so Aloy might make the climb to the spire in time to stop her enemy. Upon reaching the base of the Alight, her worst fears were realized, as the spire began to transmit Hades' will. From the sacred land to sunfall, long slumbering Faro machines had begun to unearth themselves. The countdown for life's very existence on this planet had begun, and time was running out. Climbing to the top of the spire, at the foot of the transmission array, Aloy, Varl, Talana, and Erend battled against the might of Hades. Though the fight was fraught with peril, Aloy was able to pierce the housing of Hades and initiate the master override of Elizabeth Sobek, Alpha Prime, and purged Hades from the system. With its transmission halted, the Chariot Line robots returned to their timeless sleep, and atop the Alight, those who survived celebrated victory. A triumph of peoples for a moment united by a common cause, the preservation of life. With the battle won, that night, those gathered in Meridian rejoiced. Despite the merriment, there were some among them whose spirit remained restless. In the midst of the festivities, on the back of a strider, Aloy departed, beginning her search for the final resting place of Dr. Sobek. As the city worked to rebuild itself, Sunhawk Talana too felt the pull of the wilds and would embark on her own journey. For a time, she did reunite with Aloy, but only briefly, as they both sought their own individual goals. Talana would battle new and deadly machines like Claw Striders and Shell Snappers in an effort to save lives beyond the Sundom. With the help of the fugitive Amadis, she would succeed in fulfilling the will of the Hunter's Lodge and find new purpose in the hunts of the future. For Aloy, she would indeed find Dr. Sobek. In Elizabeth's final days, after leaving Gaia Prime, she eventually found her way back to Sobek Ranch, presumably located to the outskirts of present-day Carson City, Nevada, and in the beginnings of the Forbidden West. With the repaired logs of Gaia and Elizabeth, Aloy would begin to understand the person whom she'd shared so much with beyond the purely physical. How both of them, with unstoppable will and enough compassion, would both in their own way heal the world in the service of life. Far from Aloy, Silence too found what he was looking for. With the design of his spear, the memory of Hades was transported from the Alight to an external housing in the Tinkerer's possession. With the subfunction in hand, Silence once again had the means to continue his ever-consuming search for knowledge and the secrets of the past. With this, we come to an end of the present history of Horizon, and Aloy's story in Zero Dawn. A truly remarkable world and lore, which is sure to only become yet more vibrant and impactful with what we know will come in the sequel. Though there is still so much unknown to us, we do know the world is again in dire straits. Beginning 6 months after the events of HZD, Aloy will now venture into the Forbidden West in search of answers to several threats facing the globe. A collapsing biosphere, massive supercell storms, and a red blight suffocating all life it comes into contact with are but a few of the monumental challenges Aloy must overcome to save the world. Rebel Tenakth have mastered the ability to override machines and threaten the clan balance of the tribe, while Silence still remains at large, weaving an ever wider web of influence and knowledge, hoping to achieve goals of which we still have very little understanding. all mysteries we will soon be able to uncover when we head west in the next chapter of Aloy's journey. Until then, whether you're brand new to Horizon or ready to jump back in, I hope you've enjoyed this comprehensive dive into the game's lore. I'd like to thank friend of the channel and excellent Horizon content creator, The Patient Wolf, for some of the amazing cutscene footage featured in this video. Be sure to check out all of his great content on Horizon, along with his in-depth lore playthrough of the first game. Links in the description. Despite having covered the full chronological history of the game's universe so far, there are so many deeper details into each of these stories. So if you're curious about any of these events we didn't cover quite as extensively as you may have hoped, be sure to check out our other Horizon lore videos. Odds are, we've covered what you're looking for. But until next time, thanks so much for watching, and keep questing.